In general, the key to everything was the position of Britain, for the aims of the other countries concerned were relatively simple. As a result of this dualistic, or as Lord Halifax biographer calls it, diarchic policy of Britain, there was not only two policies, but two groups carrying them out. The Foreign Office, under Lord Halifax, tried to satisfy the public demand for an end of appeasement and the construction of a united front against Germany. Chamberlain, with his own personal group, including Sir Horatio Wilson, Sir John Salmon, and Sir Samuel Hoare, sought to make secret concessions to Hitler in order to achieve a general Anglo-German settlement on the basis of the 7 points. The one policy was public, the other secret. Since the Foreign Office knew of both, it tried to build up the peace front against Germany so that it would look sufficiently imposing to satisfy public opinion in England and to drive Hitler to seek his desires by negotiations rather than by force, so that public opinion in England would not force the government to declare a war that they did not want in order to remain in office. This complex plan broke down because Hitler was determined to have a war merely for one personal emotional thrill of wielding great power, while the other effort to make a peace front sufficiently collapsible so that it could be cast aside if Hitler either obtained his goals by negotiation or made a general settlement with Chamberlain merely resulted in making a peace front which was so weak it could neither maintain peace by the threat of force nor win a war when peace was lost. Above all, these involved maneuvers drove the Soviet Union into the arms of Hitler. The complex scheme meant that the British government accepted the events of March 15th, except for feeble protests. These were directed less against the deed itself than against the risk of agitating public opinion by the deed. On March 15th, Chamberlain told the Commons that he accepted the seizure of Czechoslovakia and refused to accuse Hitler of bad faith. But 2 days later, when the howls of rage from the British public showed that he had misjudged the electorate, he went to his constituency in Birmingham on March 17th and denounced the seizure. However, nothing was done except to recall Henderson from Berlin for consultations and cancel a visit to Berlin with the president of the Board of Trade planned for March 17th to 20th. The seizure was declared illegal, but was recognized in fact at once, and efforts were made to recognize it in law by establishing a British consulate general accredited to Germany at Prague. Moreover, £6 million in Czech gold reserves in London were turned over to Germany with the puny and untrue excuse that the British government could not give orders to the Bank of England. The German acquisition of the Czech gold in London was by one episode in an extensive and largely secret plan for economic concessions to Germany. For Chamberlain and his friends, the Czechoslovak crisis of March 1939 was merely an annoying interruption to their efforts to make a general agreement with Germany in terms of the 7 points we had already mentioned. These efforts had been interrupted after March 3rd, 1938, by the Czechoslovak crisis of that year, but they remained the chief item in Chamberlain's plans, and he tried to get Hitler to discuss these projects when the two leaders came face to face on September 15th at Berchtesgaden. Hitler interrupted and turned the discussion at once to the crisis. Again, after the Munich Agreement, which was signed on September 30th, Chamberlain tried to get the Führer to discuss a general settlement, but he was evaded. This process was continued for a year, Chamberlain and his friends proposing concessions and Hitler either evading or ignoring them. There was a slight change, however, after September 1938. Chamberlain's project was widened to include economic concessions, and the efforts to achieve it became increasingly secret, especially after the events of March 1939. After September 1938, the 7-point project was broadened by adding an 8th point, economic support for Germany, especially in exploiting Eastern Europe. The German economic situation was critical at the end of 1938 because of the speed of rearmament, the expense and economic disruptions arising from the mobilization of 1938, and the great shortage of foreign exchange, which hampered the importation of necessary commodities. Goring, as the commissioner of the 4-year economic plan, presented these facts at a secret conference on October 14th, 1938. The Entente governments were aware of these German problems, but instead of seeking to increase them, they sought to alleviate them. When economic and political duress was put by Germany on the countries of southeastern Europe in October and November 1938, Chamberlain defended Germany's right to do so in the House of Commons. No economic support was granted to these countries to help them to resist, except for a loan to Turkey. On the contrary, the British government, through the Federation of British Industries, began to negotiate with Germany to create a complete system of industrial cooperation, with cartels dividing the world's markets and fixing prices for over 50 industrial groups. A coal agreement was signed at Britain's request at the end of January 1939, and a general agreement was signed between the Federation of British Industries and the Reichsgruppe Industrie on March 16, 1939. In his speech on January 30th, 1939, Hitler said, "We must export or die." 2 weeks later, the British government sent Frank Ashton Gwadkin to Berlin to find out, if possible, what roads are still open to economic recovery and reconstruction and might therefore be worth pursuing, and what roads are closed. On March 5th, he reported that Germany's critical economic situation was caused by its political actions in 1938, and that it must now turn to economic actions for 1939. This, he felt, implies, though it does not necessitate some limitations of the armaments race. Secondly, it means that Germany must look toward the United Kingdom for assistance or cooperation in its economic sphere. He listed the concessions that the Germans wanted and concluded, "We should not ignore the possibilities of a more peaceful development, and we should not put Hitler in position to say that once again he made an offer of cooperation to England, and that offer was pushed aside." Accordingly, the discussions continued, and the British government announced that the president of the Board of Trade, Oliver Stanley, would go to Berlin on March 17th. The British military attaché in Berlin protested as violently as he dared against this economic appeasement in a letter of February 27th, saying, "We can only reduce the speed and scope of the universal armaments race by forcing a reduction of tempo on Germany. Germany is apparently now in dire economic straits. We have not applied the economic screw. Germany has tightened down on itself, and it is surely unsound for us to ease it before Germany has made an effort to do so herself. From the military point of view, concessions made by us to the present regime in Germany are generally to be deplored. The position in Germany and our potential allies in a possible war, above all, America, are becoming more and more convinced of our weakness and lack of will or power to stand up to Germany." When the Bohemian crisis broke on March 15th, 1939, Chamberlain announced that Oliver Stanley's visit to Berlin that weekend would be postponed, but that the economic conversations between the British and German industries associations were continuing. Public outcry continued so high that on March 28th it was announced that these negotiations were being broken off because of disturbed public opinion. However, on April 2nd, only 5 days later, the German commercial attaché in London was secretly informed that the British were ready to reopen the discussions. The amazing fact is that the British unilateral guarantee to Poland was given on March 31st, exactly halfway between the public breaking off and the secret resumption of economic negotiations. It should perhaps be mentioned that France, throughout this period, was also negotiating trade agreements to send raw materials to Germany as a result of a preliminary agreement signed during Ribbentrop's visit to Paris early in December 1938. Although the documentation is not complete, we know that this French-German agreement was in final draft by March 11th. In spite of these concessions, Hitler was thirsty for war, and replied to every concession with a new bombshell which disturbed the British public's opinion even more. In November 1938, the Germans engaged in several days of sustained atrocities against Jews, destroying their property, razing their temples, assaulting their persons, and concluded by imposing on the Jews of Germany a collective fine or assessment of 1 billion Reichsmarks. This was followed by a series of laws excluding the Jews from the economic life of Germany. Public outrage at these actions was still high when in December 1938 the Germans announced that they were increasing the submarine fleet from 45% to 100% of Britain's, as provided in the Treaty of 1935, and were remodeling 2 cruisers under the construction from 6-inch gun to 8-inch gun vessels. Every effort by Britain to persuade Germany not to do so, or even to word their announcement in a way which would allay public opinion, was rebuffed by Germany. Finally, in March came the complete destruction of Czechoslovakia. At the same time, pressure began to be applied to Poland. Germany opened its negotiations with Poland in a fairly friendly way on October 24th, 1938. It asked for Danzig and a strip a kilometer wide across the Polish corridor to provide a highway and a 4-track railroad under German sovereignty. Poland's economic and harbor rights in Danzig were to be guaranteed, and the corridor across the corridor was to be isolated from Polish communication facilities by bridging or tunneling. Germany also wanted Poland to join in an anti-Russian bloc. If these three things were granted, Germany was prepared to make certain concessions to Poland to guarantee the country's existing frontiers, to extend the Non-Aggression Pact of 1934 for 25 years, to guarantee the independence of Slovakia, and to dispose of Ruthenia as Poland wished. These suggestions were generally rejected by Poland. They were repeated by Germany with increased emphasis on March 21st, by the same time that the Germans were using pressure on Romania to obtain an economic agreement, which was signed on March 23rd. On March 17th, London received a false report of a German ultimatum to Romania. Lord Halifax lost his head and, without checking his information, sent telegrams to Greece, Turkey, Poland, Bulgaria, and the Soviet Union, asking what each country was prepared to do in the event of a German aggression against Romania. 4 replied by asking London what it was prepared to do, but Moscow suggested an immediate conference in Bucharest of France, Britain, Poland, Romania, and the Soviet Union to try to form a united front against aggression. This was March 18, 1939. This was rebuffed by Lord Halifax, who wanted nothing more than an agreement among these states to consult in a crisis, as if they would not do so anyway. Poland was reluctant to sign any agreement involving Russia. However, when news reached London of Hitler's demands on Poland, Britain suddenly issued a unilateral guarantee of the latter state, March 31st. This was extended to Romania and Greece after Italy's attack on Albania in April 13. The text of Chamberlain's guarantee to Poland is of extreme importance. He said, "Certain consultations are now proceeding with other governments in order to make perfectly clear the position of His Majesty's government. In the meantime, before those consultations are concluded, I now have to inform the House of Commons that during that period, in the event of any action which clearly threatened Polish independence, and which the Polish government accordingly considered it vital to resist with their national forces, His Majesty's government would feel themselves bound at once to lend the Polish government all support in their power." This was an extraordinary assurance. The British government since 1918 has resolutely refused any bilateral agreement guaranteeing any state in Western Europe. Now they were making a unilateral declaration in which they obtained nothing, but in which they guaranteed a state in Eastern Europe, and they were given that state the responsibility of deciding when the guarantee would take effect, something quite unprecedented. A little thought will show that all these strange features really stultify the guarantee, and the net result was to leave the situation exactly where it had been before, except that a very severe warning had been conveyed in this fashion to Germany to use negotiation and not force. If Germany used force against Poland, public opinion in Britain would force Britain to declare war whether there was a guarantee or not. The fact that Chamberlain's guarantee was temporary and unilateral left the British free to cancel it whenever necessary. The fact that it guaranteed Poland's independence and not its territorial integrity left the way open for Germany to get Danzig or the corridor by negotiation, and the fact that it came into effect when Poland wished made it impossible for Britain or British public opinion to refuse to accept any change which Poland worked out in negotiations with Hitler. Most of these points were recognized by the German government. They were pointed out in the Times of April 1st and accepted by the Chamberlain. The guarantee was accepted by Bonnet, who was, long as November, had said that he wanted to get rid of both the Franco-Polish and the Franco-Soviet alliances. The chief purpose of the unilateral guarantee to Poland was to frighten Germany. It had precisely the opposite effect. On hearing of it, Hitler made his decision to attack Poland by September 1st. Orders to this effect were issued to the German army on April 3rd, and the plans for Operation White, as it was called, were ready on April 11th. On April 28th, in a public speech to the Reichstag, Hitler denounced the Anglo-German Naval Agreement of 1935 and the German-Polish Non-Aggression Pact of 1934. He also announced the terms he had offered Poland, which had been rejected. As a result, negotiations broke off between the two powers and were never really resumed. Instead, the crisis was intensified by provocative acts on both sides. On May 22nd, a German-Italian alliance was signed. The Pact of Steel, as Mussolini called it. Here again, the wording was important. It was clearly aggressive alliance, since the parties promised to support each other, not against an unprovoked attack, as was the customary, but in all cases. At the signing, Germany was told flatly that Italy could not make war before 1943, and that the approaching war would be a war of exhaustion. The very next day, May 23rd, 1939, Hitler held a secret conference with his generals. In the course of a lengthy speech, he said, "Danzig is not the subject of this dispute at all. It is a question of expanding our living space in the East and of securing our food supplies and the settlement of the Baltic problems. Food supplies can be expected only from thinly populated areas. Over and above the natural fertility, our German exploitation will increase production enormously. There is no other possibility in Europe. Beware of gifts of colonial territory. These do not solve the food problem. Remember the blockade. If fate brings us into conflict with the West, possession of the extensive areas in the East will be advantageous. We shall be able to expect excellent harvests, even less in wartime than in peace. The population of these non-German areas will perform no military service and will be available as a source of labor. The Polish problem is inseparable from conflict with the West. Poland sees danger in a German victory in the West and will attempt to rob us of a victory there. There is, therefore, no question of sparing Poland, and we are left with the decision to attack Poland at the first suitable opportunity. We cannot expect a repetition of the Czech affair. There will be war. Our job is to isolate Poland. The success of this isolation will be the decisive factor. Therefore, the Führer must reserve the decision to give the final order to attack. There must be no simultaneous conflict with the Western powers, France or England. If there were an alliance of France, England, and Russia, I would have to attack England and France with a few annihilating blows. I doubt the possibility of a peaceful settlement with England. We must prepare ourselves for the conflict. England sees in our developments the foundations of a hegemony which would weaken England. England is therefore our enemy, and the conflict with England will be a life and death struggle." In the face of this misunderstanding and hatred on the part of Hitler, and in the full knowledge that he had every intention of attacking Poland, Britain made no real effort to build up a peace front and continued to try to make concessions to Hitler, although the British unilateral guarantee to Poland was made into a mutual guarantee on April 6. Poland guaranteed Britain's independence in exactly the same terms as Britain had guaranteed that of Poland on March 31st. No British-Polish alliance was signed until August 25th, the same day on which Hitler ordered the attack on Poland to begin on August 26th. Worse than this, no military agreements were made as to how Britain and Poland would cooperate in war. A British military mission did manage to get to Warsaw on July 19th, but did nothing. Furthermore, economic support to rearm Poland was given late in inadequate amounts and in an unworkable form. There was talk of British loan to Poland of £100 million in May. On August 1st, Poland finally got a credit of $8 million, at the time when all London was buzzing about a secret loan of £1 billion from Britain to Germany. The effect of such actions on Germany can be seen in the minutes of a secret conference between Hitler and his generals held on August 22nd. The Führer said, "The following is characteristic of England. Poland wanted a loan from England for rearmament. England, however, gave only a credit to make sure that Poland buys from England, although England cannot deliver. This means that England does not really want to support Poland." Perhaps even more surprising is the fact that France, which had been in alliance with Poland since 1921, had no military conversations with Poland after 1925, except that in August 36 Poland was given 2 billion francs as a rearmament loan. And on May 19, 1939, the Polish Minister of War signed an agreement in Paris by which France promised full air support to Poland on the first day of war, local skirmishing by the third day, and a full-scale offensive on the 16th day. On August 23rd, General Gamlin informed his government that no military support could be given to Poland in the event of war until the spring of 1940, and that a full-scale offensive could not be made by France before 1941 or 42. Poland was never informed of this change, and seems to have entered the war on September 1st in the belief that a full-scale offensive would be made against Germany in the West during September. The failure to support Poland by binding political, economic, and military obligations in the period before August 23rd was probably deliberate, in the hope that this would force Poland to negotiate with Hitler. If so, it was a complete failure. Poland was so encouraged by the British guarantee that it not only refused to make concessions, but also prevented the reopening of negotiations by one excuse after another until the last day of peace. This was quite agreeable to Hitler and Ribbentrop. When Count Ciano, the Italian foreign minister, who had been kept completely in the dark by the Germans, visited Ribbentrop on August 11th, he asked his host, "Which one do you want, the corridor or the Danzig?" The answer was, "Not any longer. We want war." Ciano was shocked and spent 2 days trying quite vainly to persuade Ribbentrop and Hitler that war was impossible for several years. France and Russia were both pushing Britain to form a triple alliance, but Britain was reluctant. Churchill and Lloyd George were pushing in the same direction, but Chamberlain fought back on the floor of the House, refusing to help from or to join any opposing blocs. He also refused to send a cabinet minister to negotiate in Moscow, and refused Eden's offer to go. Instead, he sent William, later Lord Strang, a second-rank Foreign Office official, and only on June 14th. Moreover, the British delayed the discussions to the great irritation of the Soviet leaders, although verbally they were always insisting on speed. To show its displeasure, the Soviet Union on May 3rd replaced Litvinov with Molotov as foreign minister. This should have been a warning. Litvinov knew the West and was favorable to democracy, to collective security, and to the Western powers. As a Jew, he was an anti-Hitler. Molotov, a contrast from every point of view, and could not have been impressed with British sincerity when he had to negotiate with Strang rather than Halifax or Eden. The conversations continued with Molotov, still insisting on 3 essentials. Number 1, mutual assistance in a triple alliance. Number 2, guarantees to all the border states. and 3. Specific obligations as to the amount of assistance by military convention. On May 19th, Chamberlain and Commons refused an alliance between ourselves and other countries, and pointed with satisfaction to that great virile nation on the borders of Germany, which under the agreement on April 6th is bound to give us all the aid and assistance it can. Of course, he was talking about Poland. He seemed not to realize that Poland was much weaker than Czechoslovakia that had been wrecked in 1938, but he should have known better because the French clearly knew better. Poland indeed was opposed to any agreement of the Western powers with the Soviet Union and refused either to be guaranteed by the latter or to accept military assistance from her, even if attacked by Germany. Poland feared that if Russian troops ever entered the areas which it had taken from Russia in 1920, they could never be persuaded to leave. When Russia suggested in May that the Polish-Romanian alliance of 1926, which had directed exclusively against Russia, should now be extended to oppose Germany as well, Poland refused, although Romania was willing. In the same month, Romania agreed to allow Russian troops to cross the country to opposite Germany if needed, and Romania's position was more delicate than Poland's regarding territory previously taken from Russia, because Russia had never recognized the Romanian acquisition of Bessarabia. On June 6th, Latvia, Estonia, and Finland sent a flat refusal to be guaranteed by Russia. The next day, Estonia and Latvia signed non-aggression treaties with Germany, and probably secret military agreements as well, since General Franz Halder, the German chief of staff, went at once to these countries to inspect their fortifications, which were being constructed by Germany. Strang arrived in Moscow only on June 14th, almost 2 months after Britain had opened these discussions. By July, new difficulties arose because of the Russian insistence on a military convention as an integral part of any treaty. Britain demurred, but finally reluctantly agreed to conduct the military negotiations at the same time as the political negotiations. However, the members of the military mission took a slow ship, chartered for the occasion, speed 13 knots, and did not reach Moscow until August 11th. They were again negotiators of the second rank, an admiral who had never been on the Admiralty staff, a purely combat army general, and an air marshal who was an outstanding flyer, but not a strategist. To negotiate with these three, the Soviet Union named the commander-in-chief of the Russian army, the commander-in-chief of the Russian navy, and the chief of the Russian general staff. In London, according to rumor, neither side wanted an agreement, and the military mission had been sent to Moscow to spy out Russia's defenses. From this time on, the obstacles to an agreement were clearly coming from the Russian side, although considering Chamberlain's secret efforts to make a settlement with Germany, there is no reason to believe that he wanted an agreement with Russia. But perhaps his negotiators in Moscow did. Certainly the French did. From August 10th on, the Russians demanded specific answers and raised their own demands with every answer. They wanted the exact military commitment as to what forces would be used against Germany in the west, so that she would not be free to hurl her whole force against the east. They wanted guarantees whether the states concerned accepted or not. They wanted specific permission to fight across territory, such as Poland, between Russia and Germany. These demands were flatly rejected by Poland on August 19th. On the same day, Russia signed the commercial treaty with Germany. 2 days later, France ordered its negotiators to sign the documents offered by Russia, including the right to cross Poland, but the Soviet Union refused to accept this signature until Poland consented as well. On the same day, it was announced that Ribbentrop was coming to Moscow to sign an aggression pact. He arrived with a staff of 32 persons in a Condor plane on August 23rd, and signed the agreement with Molotov late that night. The published portion of this agreement provided that neither signer would take any aggressive action against the other signer or give any support to a third power in such action. A secret protocol, which was added, delimited spheres of interest in Eastern Europe. The line followed the northern boundary of Lithuania and the Nauru, Vistula, and San rivers in Poland, and Germany gave Russia a free hand in Bessarabia. This agreement was greeted as a stunning surprise in the Entente countries. There was no reason what should have been. as they had been warned of the possibility on numerous occasions by responsible persons, including Germans like Kort and Weizsäcker. It was also stated that the negotiations leading up to the agreement had been going on for months, and that the Anglo-Soviet discussions, accordingly, were always a blind. The evidence seems to indicate that the first tentative approaches were made in May 1939 and were reported to Paris at once by the French ambassador Robert Coulondre from Berlin. These approaches were distrustfully received by both sides and were broken off completely at Hitler's order on June 29th. They were reopened by the Germans on July 3rd. Only on August 15th did Molotov announce his conviction that the Germans were really sincere, and the negotiations proceeded rapidly from that point. While it is untrue to say that the German-Soviet non-aggression pact made the war inevitable, it certainly made it possible for Hitler to start his war with an easier mind. On August 25th, he gave the order to attack on August 26th, but cancelled it within a few hours. A word arrived that the British had signed an alliance with Poland that same day. Now began a week of complete chaos in which scores of people ran about Europe trying to avoid the war or to make it more favorable to their side. The British begged the Poles and Germans to negotiate. The Italians tried to arrange another four-power conference. Various outsiders issued public and private appeals for peace. Secret emissaries flew back and forth between London and Germany. All this was in vain because Hitler was determined on war. Most of his attention in the last few days was devoted to manufacturing incidents to justify his approaching attack. Political prisoners were taken from concentration camps, dressed in German uniforms and killed on the Polish frontier as evidence of Polish aggression. A fraudulent ultimatum with 16 superficially reasonable demands on Poland was drawn up by Ribbentrop and presented to the British ambassador when the time limit had already elapsed. It was not presented to the Poles, perhaps because they were so afraid of a second Munich that they hardly dared to talk with anyone. Indeed, the Polish ambassador in Berlin had been ordered by Beck not to accept any documents from the Germans. In the German invasion of Poland at 4:45 a.m. on September 1st, 1939, did not by any means end the negotiations for peace, nor for that matter did the complete collapse of Polish resistance on September 16th, 17th. Since these efforts were futile, little need be said to them except that France and Britain did not declare war on Germany until more than 2 days had elapsed. During this time, no ultimatums were sent to Germany, but she was begged to withdraw her forces from Poland and open negotiations. While Poland shuddered under the impact of the first blitzkrieg, British public opinion began to grumble, and even the government's supporters in Parliament became restive. Finally, at 9 a.m. on September 3rd, Henderson presented to Schmidt, Hitler's interpreter, an ultimatum which expired at 11 a.m. In a similar fashion, France entered the war at 6 p.m. on September 3rd. The German invasion of Poland began with powerful air attacks at 4:40 a.m. on September 1st. These attacks, aimed at airfields, assembly points, and railroads, wiped out the Polish Air Force of 377 planes, mostly on the ground, and in combination with the rapidly advancing German armored spearheads of tank divisions, made it impossible for Poland to mobilize completely. Crippled Polish reconnaissance destroyed any centralized system of communication and reduced Polish resistance to numerous fragments of uncoordinated fighting units. The Poles had 30 infantry divisions, a motorized brigade, 38 companies of tanks, and large masses of cavalry, but could only bring a portion of these into action. Germany struck at Poland with 2,000 planes. 400 of these were dive bombers, supporting 44 divisions, of which 6 were armored or panzer divisions, and 6 were motorized. These forces were organized into 5 armies. The Fourth Army drove down from Pomerania in the northwest, while the 8th and 10th Armies drove upward from Saxony, the 3 converging in a pincers movement at a point west of Warsaw. At the same time, a much larger pincer converging in the Bug River, 100 miles east of Warsaw, was formed by the German Third Army, advancing from the Polish corridor in East Prussia, and the German 14th Army dividing northwest from Galicia and Slovakia. The armored division, supported by dive bombers, raced ahead of their supporting infantry and disrupted all Polish plans, communications, and supplies. The Polish forces, caught in two advanced positions, vainly tried to fight their way eastward to the Vistula and the Bug rivers, but were broken up, isolated, and destroyed. Violent but hopeless fighting continued in the pockets, but by September 15th, when Guderian's tanks entered Brest-Litovsk in eastern Poland, the country had been destroyed. Although Britain and France declared war on Germany on September 3rd, it cannot be said that they made war during the next 2 weeks, in which fighting raged in Poland. British airplanes roamed over Germany, dropping leaflets for propaganda purposes, and French patrols ventured in the spaces between the Maginot Line and the German West Wall, but no support was given to Poland. Although France had 3 million men under arms and Hitler had left only 8 regular divisions on his western border, no attack was made by France. Strict orders were issued to the British Air Force not to bomb any German land forces, and these orders were not modified until April 1940. Similar orders by Hitler to the Luftwaffe were maintained for part of the same period. When some British members of parliament, led by Amery, put pressure on the government to drop bombs in German munition stores in the Black Forest, the Air Minister, Sir H. Kingsley Wood, rejected the suggestion with asperity, declaring, "Are you aware it is private property? Why, you would be asking me to bomb Essen next." Essen was the home of the Krupp munition factories. Similar efforts to force the French to take some action against Germany were rejected on the grounds that this might irritate the Germans so that they would strike back at the Western powers. To quiet the English Parliamentary group, which was demanding action, its leading figure, Winston Churchill, was made First Lord of the Admiralty, but the British Navy went into action so slowly that the German pocket battleships were able to escape from the ports and from the North Sea out to the high seas, where they could become commerce raiders. Blockade of Germany was established in such a perfunctory fashion that large quantities of French iron ore, as well as other commodities, continued to go to Germany through the neutral Low Countries in return for German coal coming by the same route. These exchanges continued for weeks. On his part, Hitler issued orders to his air force not to cross the western frontier except for reconnaissance, to his navy not to fight the French, and to his submarines not to molest passenger vessels, and to treat unarmed merchant ships according to the established rules of international prize law. In open disobedience to these orders, a German submarine sank the liner Athenia, westward bound in the Atlantic without warning, with a loss of 112 lives on September 3rd. As Poland was collapsing without a hand being raised to help it, the Soviet Union was invited by Hitler to invade Poland from the east and occupy the areas which had been granted to it in the Soviet-German agreement of August 23rd. The Russians were eager to move in order to ensure that Germans stopped as far away as possible from Soviet frontiers, but they were desperately afraid that if they did enter Poland, the Western powers might declare war on Russia in support of their guarantee to Poland, and would then wage war against the Soviet Union, while not fighting Germany, or even while allowing economic and military aid to go to Germany. Accordingly, the Kremlin held up its invasion of Poland until September 17th. On that day, the Polish government petitioned Romania to allow to seek refuge in that state. The Soviet Union felt that it could not be accused of aggression against Poland if no Polish government still existed on Polish soil. The Soviet leaders sought to justify their advance into Polish territory with the excuse that they must restore order and provide protection for the Ruthenian and White Russian peoples of eastern Poland. The Soviet and Nazi army met without incidents. On September 28th, a new agreement was made between Molotov and Ribbentrop, dividing Poland. Accordingly, Lithuania was shifted into the Soviet sphere, while in Poland itself, the German sphere was extended eastward from Vistula to the Bug River along the old Curzon line because Russia wanted to follow the national boundary. Hitler's orders to attack France through the Netherlands and Belgium were issued on October 9, 1939, and the date of the attack was set on November 8th. This was postponed on November 7th between the date and May 10th. The order to attack was given and revoked half a dozen times because of adverse weather conditions and lack of munitions. Each of these orders were reported to the West through the Dutch military attaché in Berlin, but as no attack eventuated, it is probable that the faith in this informant declined. Information also came from other sources. One order to attack was reported to the West by Count Ciano, the Italian foreign minister, but the Italians were dependent on their own spies since they could get no information directly from Hitler and did not know of the date which was finally to be used on May 10th. In January, a German plane with operational orders for the attack made an emergency landing in Belgium. The orders were captured before they could be destroyed completely. This caused great alarm in the West, but no one could be sure if the captured documents were authentic or part of a Nazi false alarm. In the meantime, from December 1939 onward, plans to invade Norway were prepared at the insistence of German admirals. These plans were made in cooperation with Major Vidkun Quisling, a former Norwegian Minister of War and a leader of an insignificant Nazi party in Norway. Formal orders were issued by Hitler on March 1, 1940, to occupy both Denmark and Norway. Violations of the Norwegian neutrality by both sides in the early months of 1940 influenced these plans very, very little. In February, the British Navy intercepted German prison ship Altmark in Norwegian waters and released about 300 British sailors who had been captured by the German commerce raider Graf Spee. On April 7th, the British placed a minefield in Norwegian waters to interrupt the flow of Swedish iron ore down the western coast of Norway from Narvik to Germany. But by that time, the German operations had begun. Denmark yielded to German ultimatum on April 9th as German divisions overran that country, and seaborne forces landed in Copenhagen harbor. The same morning, secret German agents inside Norway and troops smuggled into Norwegian harbors in merchant vessels seized Norwegian airfields, radio stations, and docks. They were supported at once by airborne infantry in Oslo, Stavanger, and by seaborne forces at Oslo, Trondheim, Bergen, and Narvik. Although German naval losses were large, including 3 cruisers and 11 destroyers, the operation was a complete success. Oslo was captured in its sleep the first day, and the Luftwaffe had air supremacy over most of Norway by the end of that day. The Allied Expeditionary Force, which had been prepared for Finland with some additional forces from France, was committed to Norway in a scattered and piecemeal fashion, chiefly around Trondheim and Narvik. The Trondheim expedition was badly bungled and had to be evacuated to sea on May 1st. The Narvik expedition captured that city on May 27th, but began to evacuate, taking the Norwegian royal family with it a week later. In the operation, British naval losses were heavy and included the aircraft carrier Glorious. The Norwegian fiasco brought Britain's increasingly restive public opinion to the boiling point. In the parliamentary debate of May 7th to 10th, Chamberlain feebly defended his policies, but was subjected to a devastating attack from all sides. The high point was reached when Leopold Amory, repeating Cromwell's words to the Long Parliament, cried at Chamberlain, "You have sat too long here for any good you have been doing. Depart, I say let us have done with you. In the name of God, go." In the following vote of confidence, Chamberlain was victorious, 281 to 200, but his normal majority of 200 had fallen to 81, equivalent to a defeat. The next day, May 9th, 1940, the Speaker was very busy preventing the honorable members from continuing their attack on Chamberlain. On May 10th, at dawn, the German armies struck westward against the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. Chamberlain resigned and was replaced by a national government under Winston Churchill. After 40 years of parliamentary life, during much of which he had been the best hated man in the House of Commons, Churchill's arrival to the highest political office was received by Englishmen with a sigh of relief. Right or wrong, fairly or unfairly, Churchill had always been a fighter, and in May 1940, as the German armies swept westward, what the forces of decency and democracy needed was a fighter to provide a nucleus about which those who wished to resist tyranny and horror could rally. In his first speech, the new Prime Minister provided such a nucleus. All he had to offer was blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Our only aim is victory, he said, for without victory there is no survival. In the next 6 months, neither victory nor survival seemed very likely for the West. The German forces which attacked on May 10th were inferior in manpower to the forces which faced them, but were much more unified, used their equipment in an effective fashion, and had a single plan which they proceeded to carry out. Amounting to about 136 divisions, they were opposed by 156 divisions, but the defenders were divided into 4 different national armies, or arranged improperly, were given tasks too difficult for their size and equipment, and in general were mangled, that their weakest points coincided completely with the most powerful German attacks. The French plan of campaign was dominated by 2 factors: the Maginot Line and Plan D. The Maginot Line, an elaborate and expensive system of permanent fortifications, ran from Switzerland to Montmedy. Behind this line, where they could not be used in great battle drawing near, were stationed 62 of 102 French divisions on this frontier. From Montmedy to the sea, France had 40 divisions, plus the British Expeditionary Force of 10 divisions. According to Plan D, the anticipated German attack on the Low Countries was to be made by Allied forces north of Montmedy, advancing as rapidly as possible to meet the enemy. If the Belgian army of 20 divisions were successful in holding up the German advance, it was hoped that a new Belgian-British-French line could be formed along the Dial River, or even 40 miles farther north along the Albert Canal. If the Belgian defense were less successful, the new line was to be formed along the Scheldt River, 50 miles behind Dial. To carry out this rapid movement as soon as the German attack was announced, the French placed their best and fastest divisions on the extreme left, in Henry Guignerol's 7th Army, and their poorest divisions close to the end of the Maginot Line, the André Corp's 9th Army, where they were expected to make a relatively short advance to take a position between Sedan and Namur along the Meuse River. Once this Plan D advance into the Low Countries had been achieved, it was expected that the new line from the Sea of Longwy deep in the Maginot Line would stand as follows: Netherlands forces be 10 divisions, Gerard's 7th Army 7 divisions, Belgium's forces 20 divisions, Lord Gore's British Expeditionary Force 10th divisions, Jean Blanchard's 1st Army 6 divisions, Corps 9th Army 9 divisions, and Charles Hunsiger's 2nd Army 7 divisions. Originally, the German plans were, as the French anticipated, a modified version of the Schlieffen Plan of 1905, involving a wide sweep through the Low Countries. The false alarms of the German attack in the winter of 1939 to 1940 revealed to the Germans, however, that the Allies would meet this attack by a rapid advance into Belgium. Accordingly, as a suggestion of General Erich von Manstein, the Germans modified their plans to encourage the Allied advance into Belgium, while the Germans planned to strike with their greatest strength at Sedan, the pivot of the Allied turning movement. Such an assault on Sedan made it necessary for the German forces to pass over the narrow, winding roads of Ardennes forest, then to cross the deep and swift Meuse River, and to break between Corrup's and Hunsiger's forces. But if this could be done, and Sedan taken, excellent roads and railroads ran from Sedan westward across France to the sea. Under the Manstein plan, the German attack from North Sea to Sedan was organized in 4 armies. In the north, the Netherlands was attacked by the German 18th Army, 1 Panzer and 4 infantry divisions. In the middle, Belgium was attacked by the German 6th Army, 2 Panzer and 15 infantry divisions, and German 4th Army, 2 Panzer and 12 infantry divisions. Further south, in the Ardennes Sea area, France was attacked by the German 12th Army, 5 Panzer and 4 other divisions. From Sedan to Switzerland, although Germany had about 30 divisions, all were infantry formations, and no major offensive was made. The Manstein plan was a total surprise to the French. They were so convinced that the Ardennes were impassable for large forces, especially for tanks, that everything was done to make the German task easier. Corrup and Hunsinger placed their poorest forces, 6 Series B divisions undermanned with little training, on either side of Sedan, and their best forces on their fronts most remote from the Ardennes, that is, from the Sedan. In Hunsinger's case, these better divisions were behind the Maginot Line itself. Because of the Ardennes, Corrup gave his 4 poor divisions near Sedan, no anti-tank guns, no anti-aircraft guns, and no air support, reserving these for his high-quality divisions 40 miles further north, and expected them to defend a front of 10 miles per division, while the French Third Army, deep behind the Maginot Line, had a front of 1.8 miles per division. Moreover, corps per divisions were not stationed on the Meuse, but 2 days' march to the west of it, and were required, once the German attack began, to race the Germans to the intervening river. The German attack began at 5:35 on May 10th. 2 days later, the Panzer Division from the German 18th Army broke through the Dutch defenses and began to join with the parachute and airborne forces which had been dropped behind these. The Netherlands collapsed. The Dutch field forces surrendered on May 14th, after much of the center of the Rotterdam had been destroyed in a 20-minute air attack. The Netherlands royal family and the government moved to England to continue the war. The great mass of the German attack fell on Belgium, and was greatly aided by the failure of many ordinary defensive precautions. Vital bridges over the Meuse and Albert Canal were destroyed only partly or not at all. The defenders of the Albert Canal were attacked from the rear by parachutists and glider forces which had been landed behind them. The powerful fort of Ibn Emal, covering the canal bridges, was captured by airborne volunteers who landed on its roof and destroyed its gun apertures with explosives. Belgian forces fell backward toward Dyle as the French and British units, according to Plan D, wheeling eastward on Sedan as a pivot to meet him. As the Belgian forces withdrew northwest while the German attack swung southwest, the main burden of the German assault now fell on the French First Army. To pin it down and thus prevent it from reinforcing corps farther south, in this the Germans were successful. On May 15th, as news of the breaking through at Sedan became known, Gamelin ordered all forces in Belgium to fall backward from the Dyle line toward the Scheldt. The attack through the Ardennes and Corps' 9th Army was made by special German forces of 5 Panzer and 3 motorized divisions under General Paul von Kleist. These passed through the forest and crossed the Meuse to fling themselves on the right side of Corps' inexperienced divisions. By the evening of May 15th, Corps' army had been volatilized, and the German spearhead was racing forward 35 miles west of Sedan. The misplaced French 6th Army, in reserve 300 miles south near Lyon, began to move toward the breach, while General Gerard, with 3 divisions from the 7th Army, was ordered from the extreme northwest, and 7 other divisions were taken from the forces behind the Maginot Line. All these arrived too late, because von Kleist advanced units across France and reached the sea at Abbeville on May 20th, having covered 220 miles in 11 days. No coordinated attack was ever made on this thin, extended line, although orders were issued for it to be attacked both from the north and the south. The Allied forces retreating southwest from Belgium were greatly hampered by masses of refugees clogging the roads, were constantly harassed by Stukas, and had lost communication between units. There was almost no contact or cooperation between the French, British, and Belgians in the north, or between these and the French forces south of Kleist's breakthrough. Panic swept Paris. On May 16th, 16 French generals, including Gamelin, were dismissed, and the command given to Weygand, who did not arrive from Syria until May 20th. During this period of evacuation of the government, to Tours was ordered, and the secret archives of the foreign ministry were burned in the bonfires on the lawns of Quai d'Orsay. On May 17th, Reynaud replaced Daladier as Minister of National Defense and generally shook up the government, replacing many weak men by defeatists, appeasers, and fascist sympathizers. The chief new face was that of Marshal Pétain, 83-year-old, the man chiefly responsible for the inadequacy of French military planning in the interwar period. Pétain was recalled from the ambassadorship in Madrid to be vice premier in the new cabinet. Certain French politicians, including Pierre Laval, hoped that Pétain might play a role in French domestic politics, such as Hindenburg had played in Germany, to protect the organized vested interests of industry and business from changes by the left in the period of defeat. Weygand spent 5 days, May 20th to 25th, in an unsuccessful effort to get a coordinated attack on Kleist salient. On May 25th or 26th, Kleist moving up the coast from Somme on the rear of the Northern Allied forces captured Boulogne and Calais, leaving Dunkirk as the only major port on the Allied rear. Withdrawal to this port was threatened by a German break through the Belgian army toward Ypres. On May 27th, King Leopold of Belgium made an unconditional surrender of his armies to the Germans, over the objections of Belgian civil government and without making certain that the Allied command had been informed. The British expeditionary force at once began to evacuate the continent through Dunkirk. In 7 days, using 887 watercraft of all types and sizes, 300,000 men were taken off the beaches of Dunkirk under relentless air bombardment, May 28th through June 4th. By Hitler's direct order, no intensive ground attack was made on the Allied forces within the Dunkirk perimeter, as Hitler was convinced that Britain would make peace as soon as France was defeated, and wished to save his dwindling armored forces and munitions for the attack on the rest of France. In the interval before this new attack, Weygand tried to form a new line along Somme and Aisne rivers from the sea to the Maginot Line, and to eliminate the 3 bridgeheads that Germans already held up south of Somme. The Battle of France began on June 5th with German attacks on the western and eastern ends of the Weygand line. By June 8th, the western end had been broken, and German forces began to move to the rear of the Somme defenses. As the line collapsed and the military forces fell back, they disintegrated among packed masses of civilian refugees hurried onward by German dive bombers. Paris and later all cities of France were declared open cities, not to be defended. Just as in Kleist's original breakthrough, no effort was made to hold up the Germans by road obstacles, civilian resistance, house-to-house fighting, destruction of supplies, or above all, destruction of abandoned gasoline. The German armored units roamed at will on captured fuel. On June 12th, Weygand requested the French government to seek an armistice. Renaud refused to permit any civilian surrender, since this was forbidden by the Anglo-French Agreement of March 12, 1940. Instead, he gave permission for a military capitulation. If the civil government continued the war from French North Africa or from overseas bases, as Norway and Netherlands and Belgium were doing. Pétain, Weygand, and their supporters refused to leave France. They also flatly rejected any military capitulation, for they wanted to end the fighting with an armistice, which would allow France to maintain a French army as a guarantee against any economic or social changes in France. As the military collapse continued, piteous appeals for help were sent to London and to Washington. Renaud sent 18 messages to Churchill asking for more air support, but could obtain none, as the British War Cabinet wished to save all the planes it had for the defense of Britain after the French collapse. Appeals to Roosevelt were no more successful. 150 planes and 2,000 75mm cannons were sent, but they sailed from Halifax only on June 17th and were at sea when fighting ceased. The chief concern in London and Washington was over the fate of the French fleet and the French North and West Africa, especially Dakar. If Hitler obtained the French fleet, or any considerable portion of it, British and American security would be in acute jeopardy. The French fleet was of high quality and included 2 new battleships, which had just been built but were not yet in service. Such a navy, in combination with the German and Italian navies, might destroy Britain's sea defenses and force a British surrender. This would place America in great danger, as American security in the Atlantic had been preserved by the British fleet since 1818, and by 1940 the whole American battle fleet had been kept in the Pacific to face Japan. Only less immediate than these dangers was the threat to both British and American security from German occupation of the French North and West Africa. This would close the British route through the Mediterranean immediately and allow the Italian forces in Libya to invade Egypt with relative impunity. The possession of Dakar by German forces would provide a base from which submarines could attack the British route to the east by way of South Africa, and might permit an attack on Brazil, only 1,700 miles west of Dakar. With these considerations in mind, Washington and London did all they could to dissuade Mussolini from attacking France, and to persuade the French to avoid any armistice which might yield either French Africa or the French fleet to Hitler. Eventually, Britain gave permission to France to seek an armistice if the fleet sailed to British ports. This was rejected by the French military and naval authorities. As a final effort, Churchill, on June 16th, offered France a political union with Britain involving joint Anglo-French citizenship and a joint cabinet. This was never considered by the French. As the military debacle continued to grow, Reynaud would not make a separate peace and could not get a cabinet agreement to withdraw overseas. He resigned June 16 and was replaced by a new government headed by Marshal Pétain. The old man surrounded by defeatists and appeasers who had been intriguing for deals with the Nazis for years, at once asked for an armistice and issued an ambiguous public statement which led some French units to cease fighting immediately. On June 10th, Italy had declared war, but was unable to make any important military advances against French resistance. On June 14th, the Germans entered Paris, the French government having moved to Tours on June 11th and continuing to Bordeaux on June 15th. The armistice negotiations were conducted in the same railway carriage in Compiègne, where Germany had surrendered in 1918. They took 3 days and went into effect on June 25th. Hitler was so convinced that Britain would also make peace that he gave surprisingly lenient terms to France. In spite of Mussolini's demands, France did not have to give up any overseas territory or any ports on the Mediterranean, no naval vessels or any airplanes or armaments to be used against England. Northern France and all its western coast to the Pyrenees came under occupation, but the rest was left unoccupied, ruled by a government free from direct German control and policed by French armed forces. The chief burden of the surrender came from 3 provisions. Number 1, the division of the country into 2 zones, with about 2/3 of French productive capacity in the occupied zones. Number 2, all French prisoners of war, amounting to almost 2 million men, were to remain in German hands until the final peace treaty, while the German prisoners were to be released at once. And 3, all the expenses of the German occupation were to be paid by the unoccupied France. The 2 zones were sealed off so completely that even postal communication was reduced to a minimum. This crippled the economy of the unoccupied part. The expenses of the army of occupation were set at an outrageous sum of 400 million francs a day. Moreover, by fixing the exchange rate at 1 Reichsmark for 20 francs in place of the pre-war rate of 1 for 11 francs, it became possible for the occupying forces to buy goods very cheaply in France, thus draining wealth to Germany. The collapse of France was one of the most astonishing events in European history. For weeks or even months, millions of persons in all parts of the world were stunned, walking about in a painful fog. Equally important, although not recognized at the time, was the determination of Britain to go on fighting. Hitler, who had won a victory surpassing his expectations, could not end the war, and was left without plans for continuing it. He began to improvise such plans without adequate information to make them good and without adequate preparation for carrying them out. If Germany had concentrated on building submarines, the newly acquired U-boat bases in Norway, in the Low Countries, and in France might have made it possible to blockade Britain into surrender. But Hitler rejected this plan. Instead, he ordered an invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, a project in which no German, not even Hitler himself, had much confidence. At the same time, Britain's refusal to make peace revealed to the full the inadequacies of the French armistice. Hitler sought to remedy these by a project to capture Gibraltar, Operation Felix. Sea Lion and Felix required Hitler's active attention from July to November 1940. In the first half of December, Hitler put Sea Lion and Felix aside and replaced them with 2 new projects. The new projects sought to conquer all the Balkans, Operation Marita, and the attack on the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. These went on into operation in April to June 1941. Hitler's change of plans in December 1940s was a consequence of 4 influences. Number 1, it was by that time clear that Sea Lion could not be carried out. Number 2, Franco's refusals to cooperate had made Felix impractical. And number 3, Mussolini's foolish attempts to conquer Egypt and Greece had opened a hornet's nest in the eastern Mediterranean. And number 4, there was a growing tension, much of it in Hitler's own mind, between Germany and the Soviet Union. Operation Sea Lion was beyond Germany's strength, but no one saw this at the time. It required, as a first necessity, air supremacy for the Luftwaffe over southern England. Following this, the invasion would require a large flotilla of invasion craft to carry men and supplies across the lengthy stretch of water, and to assemble these forces in combat formations in England. The German Navy was in no position to defend such a flotilla against the British Navy with minefields, and to preserve both the invasion flotilla and the minefields by German air superiority. Britain had adequate manpower, including the men evacuated from France and thousands of anti-Nazi refugees from overrun countries, but had little heavy equipment and certainly had only a fraction of the 39 divisions the Germans estimated to be the size of the defensive forces. These forces were hurriedly prepared, barbed wire and mines were placed on all the landing beaches, watchers were stationed everywhere, all road signs which might guide the invaders were removed, and all able-bodied men, many armed only with fowling guns, were drilled for defense against parachutists. Fortunately, none of these defensive measures ever had to be tested because Germany was unable to win air superiority over England. Although air superiority had not yet been achieved by Germany, orders for the invasions were issued at the middle of July. The date was finally fixed at September 21st, but it was postponed temporarily on September 17th and indefinitely on October 12th. These attacks of the Luftwaffe were directed successfully from July 10th to the end of October at coastal defenses, at RAF installations, and London itself. Very heavy damage was inflicted on England, but the losses to the German Air Force were more significant, reaching 1,700 planes with their pilots in 3.5 months.
Strategic launch detected.
In the same period, the British dead reached 375 pilots and over 14,000 civilians. The greatest loss for the Germans in one day was 76 planes on August 15th, but the turning point of the battle came on September 15th when 56 invading planes were shot down. The counterattack of the RAF on German bases was also very successful. Hundreds of invasion craft, in some cases loaded with German soldiers under training, were destroyed. As the Battle of Berlin drew to a close on October 1940, the Germans shifted the night bombing of British cities. This practice continued night after night, with fearful destruction and great loss of life, until Hitler's attack on the Soviet Union in June 1941. Radar was used in scientific experiments in Britain as early as 1924, adapted for defense against air attacks in 1935, and a chain of radar stations had been laid out in 1937 and began continuous operation on April 1939. Before war began in September, these stations could detect most aircraft at distances up to 100 miles. Eventually, a very elaborate centralized system could report on all enemy planes over or near Britain. After the fall of France, special night fighter planes with their own individual radar detectors with a 3-mile range were being provided. When they began to shoot down German bombers in total darkness on December 1940, the Luftwaffe did not know what was happening. By March 1940, effective radar aiming devices were being attached to anti-aircraft guns on the ground. These increased the effectiveness of such guns in shooting down enemy bombers by 5-fold. These new devices were so helpful that over 100 bombers were shot down by night fighters in the winter of 1940 to 1941, and an equal number of radar anti-aircraft guns. Science was also applied by the British night bombing raids on Germany, but at much later date. In 1940 and 1941, almost 45,000 tons of bombs were dropped on German targets, but 90% fell harmlessly in fields. In 1941, new navigational techniques using intersecting radio beams from 3 stations in England were used to provide greater accuracy in navigation for more planes. Using this method, Britain launched a 1,000-bomber raid on Cologne on May 1942. By the end of that year, an entirely new method was introduced. This had an accuracy of about 1 yard per mile of distance from base, and could place over half of the bombs dropped from 30,000 feet within 150 yards of the target at 250 miles distance. About the same time, early 1943, radar was adapted to allow bombers to see the target through night or clouds. As we have already indicated, bomb damage, however great, had no decisive effects on Germany's ability to wage war, but the growing effectiveness of British and American bombing made it necessary for Germany to devote increasing amounts of its resources and manpower to air defense and to production of fighter planes, and by drawing German planes back to Western Europe from Russia, aided the Russian defense very considerably. In planning his attack on Soviet Russia, Hitler used the customary German strategic concepts. These gave priority to the destruction of enemy armies over the siege and occupation of enemy territory and resources. This destruction was to be achieved and quickly achieved, according to Hitler, in a series of gigantic pincer movements of the double arm type which had worked so well against Poland in 1939. In these operations, a huge outer pincers of armored division spearheads and simultaneous but smaller inner pincers of infantry division columns would enclose a mass of enemy troops and armored pincers, cutting a large segment of these off from their supplies and communications, while the infantry columns would splice up the enclosed mass of enemy forces into smaller masses willing to surrender. This method was used again and again with extraordinary success against the Soviet armies after June 1941. Enclosing and frequently capturing hundreds of thousands of Russians at a time, but the very size of the operations used up Nazi men, materials, and above all, time without inflicting any fatal blow on the Soviet capacity to resist. Because of these German strategic ideas, no geographical objectives were given primary priority in the German plans. Secondary priority was given, at Hitler's insistence, to the capture of Leningrad in the north and to the capture of Kiev and the Caucasus to the south. These geographical objectives were set up in order to link up with the Finns and cut the Murmansk Railway in the north, and to capture, or at least cut off from the Russian armies, the Soviet oil centers in the south. The capture of Moscow was by Hitler's direct orders given only tertiary priority in the German strategic plans. German generals disagreed with Hitler's geographic conceptions and insisted that Moscow be made the chief geographical goal of the German advance because it was the vital railroad center of European Russia. It was also an important industrial center and contained the heart and brain of the whole Soviet autocracy. Its capture would, according to the generals, cripple Russia's ability to shift troops and supply north and south, and would thus make it possible to isolate for easier conquest the Leningrad or Kiev fronts. Moreover, its capture would paralyze the over-centralized system of Soviet tyranny and strike such a blow to Bolshevik prestige that it would probably be unable to survive. In the first 3 months of the campaign of 1941 and for all of the campaign of 1942, Hitler resisted the pressure from his generals and insisted that the maximum German effort should be devoted on the two areas originally set in the north and the south. Only in September 1941, it was too late for a successful assault on Moscow, that Hitler recognized that his own geographic objectives could not be achieved, with the result that he fell back on his general's advice for an attack on Moscow. This dispersal and shifting of geographic objectives, combined with German inability to destroy the Soviet armies completely, brought Germany to the point which Hitler had always insisted must be avoided above all else: a two-front war of attrition by Germany, which was nowhere near total economic mobilization. German authorities estimated that Russia had over 200 divisions, of which 30 to 35 were in the Far East, with 8,000 aircraft of diverse quality and 15,000 tanks, mostly light or obsolescent. On the European front, they expected to encounter 125 infantry, 25 cavalry, 25 motorized, and at least 5 armored divisions. Against these Russian forces, Hitler planned to hurl 141 German and 33 satellite Finnish, Romanian, Italian, Hungarian, Slovak, and Croat divisions. The German forces included 19 half-size armored divisions with 3,200 tanks, 14 motorized divisions, and 3 air fleets with 2,000 planes. These forces were organized into 3 army groups, northern, central, and southern, aiming in the general direction of Leningrad, 500 miles, Moscow, 750 miles, and the lower Volga, Stalingrad, 800 miles. Each army group consisted of infantry and panzer armies placed alternatively across the front in order to operate the double-clawed pincer movements we have mentioned. The whole German front from north to south had 7 infantry armies and 4 panzer armies organized in this alternating fashion, with 2 infantry armies forming each end of the line and the satellite forces on the extreme flanks, Finns in the north and others to the south. The Soviet Union was warned of the impending Nazi attack from Washington and London, as well as by its own spies, and had the exact date of the assault almost as soon as it was set in Berlin. An anti-Nazi German in Berlin gave a copy of Hitler's secret directive for Operation Barbarossa to the American commercial attaché within 3 weeks of its formulation. This was sent to Kremlin by Secretary of State Hull early in March 1941. All these helpful moves were received with ill grace by the Soviet leaders, and those who offered them were treated as troublemakers. Moscow made no effort to escape the Nazi pincers by withdrawing its forces from their exposed frontier positions, but continued to hope that its abject economic collaboration with Hitler would lead him to cancel the attack orders in recognition of the fact that he could obtain more in an economical sense from collaborating in peace than from conquest and war. This hope was futile because Hitler had such gigantic disrespect for Russia's fighting powers that he expected complete German victory in about 6 weeks. So convinced was Hitler on this point that he flatly rejected in June, again in July, and once again in August, suggestion from the chief of the great general staff that any preparation be made for fighting in winter. For this refusal, Germany was to suffer bitterly. Hitler's estimates about the weakness of the Soviet army and the brevity of the approaching campaign were generally shared by military men throughout the world. In the United States, Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall believed that Germany would be victorious in 6 weeks. The Nazi army sprang forward at dawn on Sunday, June 22, 1941. At the end of 5 days, 2 envelopments had been closed, and on the following day a third was completed. In these pockets there was such large Russian forces that the perimeters could not be closed completely, and broken Russian units escaped through the German lines. Nevertheless, from these pockets were taken 300,000 prisoners and 2,500 tanks and 1,000 cannon. By July 25th, several more encirclements had been completed on the Central Front, yielding 200,000 more prisoners with another 2,000 tanks and 2,000 guns. At this point, a crisis arose in the General High Command. All the great successes we have mentioned were on the Central Front, while the Northern and Southern fronts, which Hitler wanted emphasized, were combat units of no more than 50,000 men. At the end of the war, hundreds of thousands of Vlasov supporters fled westward, were advancing much more slowly. This resulted from the fact that Hitler's generals did not share Führer's strategic ideas and had disposed the German forces so that in effect they overruled his directives and gave preponderance to their own goal, the capture of Moscow. For this reason, they had given 2 of their 4 panzer armies to Field Marshal Fedor von Bock's Army Group Center and 1 to each of the other outer army groups. Since the Russians had massed their strength in the south, German Army Group South under Gerd von Rundstedt had only 800 tanks, while his Soviet opponent Marshal S.M. Budeny had 2,000. The brilliant success of the German Army Group Center led the German General Staff and Hitler to change their minds, but in opposite direction. The weakness of the Soviet defense persuaded Bock to adopt a plan advanced by Guderian. The Army Group Center abandoned further efforts at pincer encirclements and sent its armored units on a straight all-out drive to Moscow, 100 miles away. About the same time, Hitler decided to strengthen the advance of Army Group North and South by directing the efforts of the 2 panzer armies of Army Group Center away from their own front and onto the fronts of the 2 flanking army groups. This would have left Army Group Center with infantry forces only, thus slowing its advance and restricting its operation to tactical mopping up activities, but would have increased the ability of the flanking army groups to close pincer developments by giving each of them the use of the 2 panzer armies. By Directive Number 33, on July 19th, Hitler issued orders for this change. Although the generals resisted and stalled in carrying out these instructions, the advance on Moscow was broken. General Franz Halder wrote in his diary on July 26, "The Führer's analysis, which at many points is unjustly critical of the field command, indicates complete break with strategy of large operational conceptions. You cannot beat the Russians with operational success," he argues, because they simply do not know when they are defeated. On that account, it will be necessary to destroy them bit by bit in small encircling actions of purely tactical character. Against these ideas of Hitler's, his generals argued for weeks in vain. On August 21st, Hitler issued Directive Number 34. It began, "The proposals of the Army High Command for the continuance of the operations in the East, dated August 18th, do not conform to my intentions. The principal object is not the capture of Moscow." In place of this, it set the following objectives: to seize the Crimea and the Donbass coal mines, to cut off the Caucasian oil supplies, to isolate Leningrad and to make direct contact with the Finns. As a consequence of the shift of emphasis to the south, the German Army Group South completed a colossal envelopment east of Kiev, August 24th to September 21st. In a great bag 200 miles wide, the Germans captured 600,000 prisoners with 3,700 cannon and 1,000 tanks. Hitler called this the greatest battle in history of the world. His chief of staff called it the greatest strategic blunder of the Eastern Campaign. On September 6, 1941, in Directive Number 35, Hitler suddenly accepted the suggestions of his generals and ordered an attack on Moscow. After 2 weeks of reorganization of forces, this attack began. About the same time, Leningrad was encircled, thus commencing an unsuccessful siege, which continued until the city was relieved 28 months later. By October 8, 1941, two great encirclements west of Moscow closed on 600,000 Soviet prisoners with 5,000 cannons and 1,200 tanks. Mopping up took 2 weeks. By that time, the weather had broken, and the Germans were advancing through pouring rain, sleet, and mud. They suffered their first cases of frostbite on November 7th. With Moscow only 38 miles away, the attack continued. A week later, Siberian divisions moved from the Far East in a consequence of the Japanese-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact and Richard Sorge's information that the Japanese had decided to attack Singapore rather than Siberia appeared before Moscow. The first Soviet counteroffensive came on November 28th, just as the 2nd German Armored Division caught sight of the towers of the Kremlin from a distance of 14 miles. The next night, the temperatures fell to 22 below zero Fahrenheit. The Germans, without any preparation for a winter campaign, began to suffer horribly. Yet when Field Marshal von Rundstedt, commander of the Army Group South, allowed some of his units to withdraw, he was removed by Hitler. On December 19th, the commander-in-chief, Field Marshal Walther von Brauchitsch, was relieved of his post, taken by Hitler himself. The Fuhrer issued an order which said, "The army is not to withdraw a single step. Every man must fight where he stands." A few days later, Guderian was removed for violation of this order. In spite of Hitler's attitude, Russian pressure throughout the winter made necessary one German withdrawal after another. By the spring of 1942, many units had fallen back 100 or more miles. During this period, the Luftwaffe generally could not operate for lack of winter lubricants, and when its plane did take to the air, they had to be used to carry supplies to ground forces which were cut off by the Russians. Tanks could be used only after their engines had been warmed up for 12 hours. Frostbite casualties in the German army ran about 1,000 a day, and by February 28, 1942, the total German casualties in the Russian offensive reached over 1 million, 31%. We have mentioned that military assistance to the Soviet Union from the United States was held up by the slowness of the American economic mobilization, the anti-Bolshevism of American public opinion, and the general lack of confidence in Soviet ability to withstand the Nazi attack. These obstacles were not decisive with Churchill or Roosevelt. On July 12, 1941, Britain signed an alliance with Russia. 4 weeks later, Harry Hopkins returned from a hurried visit to Moscow to report to the Atlantic Conference his conviction that the Soviet Union would be able to hold out against the Nazi attack. He also brought a completely unreasonable demand from Stalin for an immediate British invasion of Western Europe to relieve the German pressure on Russia. Unable to grant any hopes of such an invasion in 1941 or even 1942, Roosevelt and Churchill decided to send a full-scale economic mission to Moscow to determine Russia's material needs. This mission, headed by Averell Harriman and Lord Beaverbrook, was in Moscow for 3 days at the end of September 1941 and signed an agreement for Soviet aid to June 30th, 1942. In the early summer of 1942, Soviet messages to Washington and to London continued to insist on the need for an immediate second front in Western Europe in order to reduce the Nazi military pressure on the Soviet forces. Recognizing the impossibility of such a venture in 1942, the Anglo-Americans sought to relieve the pressure on Russia by landing at a place where the German defense would not be so strong. It was this desire which resulted in the decision of July 25, 1942, to invade North Africa in November. Having made the decision to substitute this project for any possible cross-channel attack in 1942, it was necessary to convey the news to the Soviet Union. Churchill undertook this delicate task
on his first meeting with Stalin in Moscow in August 1942. The result was a most unpleasant explosion by Stalin. The Soviet leader charged that Molotov had obtained a definite promise for a second front in 1942. That failure to carry out this promise would jeopardize Soviet military plans, and that Churchill was opposed to such venture from cowardice. The strategic disputes among the three Allied powers were sharp and based on very different outlooks, but in no case did cowardice play any role. The Soviet insistence on an immediate all-out cross-channel attack to relieve Nazi pressure on Russia was perfectly understandable, although insistence on such an attack in 1942 was unrealistic. Equally understandable was Russia's fear that Anglo-Americans might divert their power from Germany in order to avoid a Soviet-dominated post-war Europe. All this fear showed no realistic appreciation of the American outlook. On the other hand, the British reluctance to attempt the cross-channel attack was perfectly clear. Sir Alan Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, opposed all plans for such an assault, while others like Churchill wanted to postpone such an attack indefinitely or reduce it to no more than a series of small raids to establish permanent anti-German bridgeheads in Western Europe. The difficulties of such raids were shown on August 19th, 1942, when a force of 5,000 men, mostly Canadians, landed at Dieppe and suffered 3,300 casualties in a few hours. The Americans, especially General Marshall, were convinced that Germany could be defeated only by a cross-channel attack and advocated one on the largest possible scale at the earliest possible date. These differences of strategic opinion reflect basic differences of outlook. The American outlook was largely military. They were eager to defeat Germany and end the war as soon as possible, and had little time or energy for political problems of post-war planning. The British, on the other hand, were much more concerned with political issues and the way in which the post-war situation would be influenced by strategic and military actions earlier. The Soviet leaders, to some extent, represented a combination of the two other points of view, and could do so because there was no such divergence between their military and political, or between their wartime and post-war aims. The more deeply the Anglo-Americans could be involved in the struggle with Germany, the sooner Germany could be defeated, and such a defeat, especially if it arose from a cross-channel attack, would deliver all Eastern Europe into the power of the Red Armies, which would find no rivals in that area. Churchill and other British leaders could not forget the terrible casualties Britain had suffered in the trench warfare of 1916. They felt that these casualties had injured Britain permanently by wiping out a whole generation of Britain's young people, especially among the better educated class, and they were determined not to repeat this error in 1944. These leaders wanted a Balkan or Aegean offensive, which they believed would be with fewer casualties, leave the English-speaking powers dominant in the Mediterranean and in the Near East, would make it possible to balance Soviet power in Eastern Europe, and would cut the Soviet Union off from the Balkans and some of Central Europe. The possibility of Britain obtaining American consent to such an Aegean offensive was so remote that little effort was made to get it by direct persuasion. On the contrary, efforts to move toward it step by step were persistent. These efforts sought to postpone or to reduce the emphasis on the cross-channel invasion, since this would inevitably have compelled the end of Britain's Mediterranean projects. But here again, American insistence on the cross-channel invasion was so emphatic that the British could not challenge this directly, just as they could not advocate the Aegean invasion directly. Instead, while accepting the cross-channel invasion explicitly, the British offered one after another alternative projects which could postpone or distract from the cross-channel invasion. In spite of Soviet scorn, the military operations in Africa and the Mediterranean were major efforts for the inexperienced forces of unmilitarized nations, although they obviously could not compare to the Nazi-Soviet deathlock involving hundreds of divisions on the plains and the forests of Eastern Europe. The victory in North Africa was completed in May 1943. 2 months later came the invasion of Sicily. The attack on the strategic island was the greatest landing assault of the war. 8 divisions coming ashore simultaneously, side by side. The island is almost a right angle triangle, with its right angle in the extreme northeast, separated from the Italian mainland by the Strait of Messina, only 3 miles wide. The landings were made on the opposite side of the island, on the hypotenuse of the triangle, where the coast forces southwest towards Tunisia. The British Eighth Army under General Montgomery, with 250,000 men and 800 ships on escort vessels, landed on the southern point of the Sicilian Triangle, while the American Seventh Army, with 200,000 men and 600 vessels, landed on the British left on either side of Gela. The defensive forces of 4 Italian divisions and 2 German panzer divisions were widely scattered on the island, and the Allied landings were skillfully executed against light resistance. Once ashore, however, the campaign was ineptly carried on because occupation of territory was given precedence over destruction of enemy forces. Patton drove northwestward to seize Palermo on July 22nd, and then followed the enemy forces eastward to Messina along the northern coast. Montgomery, moving slowly northward parallel to the eastern coast, made a detour to the west of Mount Etna. No efforts were made to close the Straits of Messina. As a result, the Germans were able to send almost 2 divisions as reinforcements from Italy, and later, when the island had to be abandoned, they were equally free to evacuate it, carrying almost 40,000 troops with 10,000 vehicles and 17,000 tons of stores over the Straits of Messina to Italy in 7 days without loss of a single man. At the same time, in a separate operation, 62,000 Italian troops also escaped to the mainland. By August 17th, Sicily had been conquered, but the evacuated enemy forces were reorganizing to defend Italy itself. Italians had no taste for the defense of Italy. They had been dragged into the war by Mussolini action and against their own desires in June 1940, and by 1943 they were heartily sick of the whole thing. This discontent was fully developed long before the attack on Sicily in June. In February, the Deuce had dismissed Count Giano, his son-in-law, and Count Dino Grandi from their post of ministers of foreign affairs and of justice because of their defeatism and opposition. But these qualities continued to spread even in the innermost circles of the government. The invasion of Sicily gave the final spurt to this development. On July 24th, the fascist Grand Council passed a motion calling for the restoration of the constitutional functions of all agencies of government and the restoration to the king of full command of the armed forces. This motion, carried 18-8, was essentially a vote of no confidence to Mussolini. The following morning, the king demanded the Duke's resignation. As he was leaving the palace, had him arrested. In preparation for the forthcoming first meetings of the Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin in Tehran, their foreign ministers met in Moscow in October 1943. Russian suggestions to force Turkey into the war or to demand air bases in Sweden were rejected, and it was generally agreed not to dismember Germany after the war, but to force the Germans to pay reparations for damages and to undergo punishment for crimes against humanity or international law. It was agreed that disarmed Germany should be ruled jointly under an inter-allied commission, and that Austria should be re-established as an independent country. The chief achievements of the conference were the signature of the Four-Nation Declaration on the United Nations. This document stated that the signers would continue to cooperate after the war for the organization and maintenance of peace and security. It further promised to create a general international organization based on the principle of the sovereign equality of all peace-loving states and open membership by all such states. The four powers also promised not to use their armies in the post-war period in the territories of other states except for the purposes envisaged in the declaration and after joint consultation, and to cooperate together to regulate post-war armaments. This declaration was significant because of the American promise not to relapse into isolation again, and because of the American success in having China accepted, admittedly with reluctance, as a great power. In reporting to a joint session of Congress on the significance of this agreement, Secretary of State Hull voiced that kind of naive idealism which made Churchill squirm. He said, "As the provisions of the Four-Nation Declarations are carried into effect, there will no longer be need for spheres of influence, for alliances, for balancing of power, or any other kind of special arrangements through which, in the unhappy past, the nations strove to safeguard their security or to promote their interests." He went on to point out as a desirable fact that questions of boundaries had been left in abeyance until the end of hostilities, as the United States had desired. At Tehran, Stalin was chiefly motivated by an intense fear of Germany and desire to strengthen the Soviet Union along its western border as protection against Germany. Apparently, this fear was so great that Stalin did not want Germany to go communist after the war, possibly from fear that such a change would strengthen it. Instead, he demanded and obtained Polish frontiers on the Curzon Line and Oder-Neisse Line, and won acquiescence for his rather moderate plans for Finland. The latter included the 1940 frontier, a Soviet naval base at Hango or Potsdam, reparations to Russia, and complete break with Germany. The British were generally unsuccessful in obtaining their desires at Tehran. They hoped to postpone Overlord and the project campaign to reopen the Burma Road, shifting the Burma equipment instead to the Aegean, but were forced to accept May 1944 target date for Overlord. While Stalin emphatically vetoed any Turkish, Aegean, or Balkan project, Stalin and Roosevelt did authorize Churchill to negotiate with Turkey in an effort to persuade that country to go to war with Germany. But no one had much hope that these efforts would be successful, and Roosevelt and Stalin generally opposed them for fear they might delay Overlord. Although the Allied cross-channel attack was not a large one, being only 5 attack divisions preceded by parts of 3 airborne divisions, it was beautifully planned, competently carried out, and encountered a number of very lucky chances, especially from the weather. The desired landing conditions were low tide, just after dawn following moonlit night. These occurred only once a month and lasted for only 3 days. In June 1944, these days were the 5th, 6th, and 7th. Bad weather making air operations difficult and impossibly heavy surf forced Eisenhower to postpone the attack on June 5th, because better weather information, expertly interpreted, showed that the Allies the weather would improve suddenly. The Supreme Commander ordered the attack to take place on June 6th, at a time when the Germans expected adverse weather to continue. The 2 American divisions went ashore on either side of the Vire River near Carentan, with Utah Beach to the west and the Omaha Beach between the Vire and Drome rivers to the east. A Canadian and 2 British divisions went ashore between the Drome and the Orne rivers in front of the Bay and Caen. Airborne divisions were dropped inland on either flank of the attack area to hold up any Army counter-thrust, and another airborne division was dropped inside Utah Beach to seize the causeways which crossed lagoons inside the beach. Tactical surprise was achieved at all points, so completely, in fact, that on Omaha Beach, the strongest German coastal battery in the west was found unmanned and unguarded. Except at Omaha Beach, where high bluffs had to be scaled under fire, the landings were immediately successful. At Omaha, the issue hung on the balance into the second day. As a result, 2,000 casualties were suffered at Omaha compared to only 200 at Utah Beach. As soon as the landings were established, men and equipment were poured into the beachheads. A great gale of June 19th to 23rd stopped all unloading for 2 days and destroyed the American artificial harbor at Omaha. But by the time the gale began, there had been put ashore 600,000 men, 95,000 vehicles, and 200,000 tons of supplies. The millionth man landed on July 6th, just a month after the first.